Good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be listening to us from here on this big, beautiful planet we call Earth. This is Michael Cross here with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions. Hey, welcome back. I think I'd like to deal a little bit here with this whole controversy centering around removal of Confederate icons and memorials and so forth, primarily in the South, but not necessarily completely, because there's plaques and stuff that are outside the South that deal with Confederates. And before I begin, I would just encourage people to subscribe to my YouTube channel, and also a little bit of plug here. If you are into dystopian literature, check out my new book, The Destiny of Our Past. You can find that on Amazon, and it actually deals with some of the issues we're going to deal with right now, because it deals with the idea of a culture that the elite are trying to make sure that the bulk of the population, referred to as the commoners, are carefully controlled and managed. And to a certain degree, that means their history and the religion is managed as well. So check that out. Anyway, what I'd like to point out first of all is, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest. Gosh, I can't remember the first time I ever visited the South, but it's probably the least part of the United States that I've actually been to. And so I never even, I think the first time I ever saw a Confederate flag in real life was in college, when someone that belonged to a club that I belonged to had a small one. And so I'm not someone who's at least myself directly, maybe ancestors and so forth, but not myself directly connected to much of the controversy going on. However, and there's always the however, I think there's a lot more to this than what meets the eye. I think there's a lot going on in reference to this issue that doesn't have to do with getting people to feel better or, to patch up past injustices or these kinds of things. I think ultimately that there may be a certain level within, the left-wing movement to erase connections to history amongst people. And that doesn't mean that many of the people who might say, well, why don't we just move them or take them down, are not motivated by good intentions. They may very well be. They may feel like, well, this could be a gesture of reconciliation, or this could be, maybe there's people in these communities who feel intimidated by statues that commemorate people who fought in the Civil War. And rightly or wrongly, many people do equate the Civil War with a fight over slavery, although it was much deeper than that, because obviously, what was it, the Corwin or something like that resolution, Cowan, you have to look, it escapes me, I think it was Cowan, that Lincoln supported, and he was willing, if the South would remain in the Union, he was willing to actually say that slavery would be protected, guaranteed, as long as the South was willing to accept policies from the North in regards to such things as the tariff. And many people don't understand the significance of the tariff, obviously, because we didn't have an income tax till 1913. So the United States pretty much ran itself on tariffs that were derived from goods that were transported from other countries, but also between, to a certain degree, although this gets more complicated, states and regions. So the idea was, I don't want to get into a whole thing about Southern history, but the whole idea was that the South was more based on agrarian economics, in which you had a very small elite of plantation owners who had a great deal of wealth, had the best land in the area, and you had a large population of people who'd settled there who were, they were basically poor farmers, subsistence farmers to a certain degree, but there was also a lot of others who were kind of mid-level. But these kind of people couldn't afford slaves. So generally speaking, the slave economy, ironically enough, maintained a situation that kept people poor who were non-slave owners. And of course it kept primarily blacks in a state of subjugation, who, the ones that were actually slaves. There were free blacks in the South, but I think the majority of the population of blacks in the South were slaves. And this was in contrast to the North, which didn't have slavery and had a more industrial base. It was more suited for building things and manufacturing things and trade. And of course that meant it was a more prosperous overall situation. And also what ultimately led to the downfall of the South in the Civil War was the fact that you had railway systems and infrastructure that was far more advanced and efficient than the South had. So you could transport goods like weapons and so forth to your troops and food. And that was not just an advantage when it came to population, but also an advantage of maintaining your troops in a war situation. So the South was numerically at a disadvantage, didn't have as many people, and it also had less efficient supply routes to its troops. But ultimately, of course, the South decided, well, we're going to go to war. And then, of course, they lost. And there's a lot of memorials that were put up for Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, and some of the memorials are just, they don't really signify any historical character. It's more like, the soldier type memorial, an anonymous sort of thing. And you could argue, okay, and some people do, that, well, they went against the Union, they lost, therefore why commemorate it? But then on the other hand, you could say, well, they ultimately were Americans, they were incorporated back into the United States, and therefore their bravery should be in some way memorialized and given significance, especially since many Southerners of all ethnic backgrounds had people who fought for the Confederacy. And the thing is that I think that many people within the left, again, I'm not talking about the people who are talking about, the good intentions, let's have reconciliation, or why should we honor people who represented the things that they find distressing about the South. But the ones that are in the true politicized left, these people, I think, ultimately have that kind of sense that you find in George Orwell's 1984, where he presents the idea that Big Brother, or the government that is represented by Big Brother, controls history. And therefore they control the present mind. They control the way people think. Because the icons you have will give you a sense of who you are, where you came from, and so forth. And maybe the left, which makes no secret of their distaste for the American culture, maybe the left feels that Southern memorials and symbols of the Civil War, that these are soft targets. Because if you can set a precedent that you can remove these statues and other things that give commemoration to the Confederacy, then you can start turning your attention on other aspects of the culture. You set a precedent. You say, well, we removed them because of A, B, and C. Let's say A is these people were racist. B could be that they could have been slaveholders. Not all the Confederate generals and so forth owned slaves, and actually some of the Union generals actually were slave owners from the border states. But again, let's not get bogged down in history too much there. The thing is that A and B, maybe they were racist and maybe they were slaveholders. Who else could that apply to? Well, first of all, I've read a lot of quotes from Abraham Lincoln, and by today's standards, he would be considered a racist, even a white supremacist. It doesn't take much to just go in and search for what Lincoln did say. Okay, he didn't believe in slavery. He was willing to work with it, and I think he wanted it abolished at some point. A lot of abolitionists were more like the gradual, let's phase it out. But if you read what he said during the Lincoln-Douglas debates in regards to race relations and other things, you'll find that, oh my gosh, his statements today would definitely be considered racist. So should we remove him from the pennies? Should we remove him from the $5 bill? Should we rename his memorial to something else in Washington, D.C.? And then, of course, we're talking about, what about Lincoln, Nebraska? Should we change the name? Now, we also could look at the fact that Thomas Jefferson and George Washington owned slaves. Now, the thing is that we have a state named Washington. We almost had a state named Jefferson, but what is now Colorado decided there was it never got named Jefferson, but they were slave owners. Now, I'm not aware of any statements they made that could be construed as racism, but I'm sure if you dig deep enough, you probably find stuff that could be construed that way. Should we remove them? Should we tear down the Washington Monument or rename it something else? Rename Washington State and so forth. You see, this is what's troubling. All societies around the world, I don't care what society you're in, what race, ethnic, religious background, they all have icons. And these icons are historical figures. And there's always something you can dig up that would be controversial, because societies change in their opinions. Okay? In the Utah State Capitol, you have a statue of Brigham Young. Now, the vast majority of people in Utah do not engage in polygamy, but one could say that maybe his statue shouldn't be there, especially since you might be making laws or enforcing laws through the state of Utah that are not in accordance with polygamy. But yet you have a statue that when you walk in, you see of probably America's most famous polygamist. And so you see what I mean? You can let's say you go to another country and there's a statue of some king. In St. Petersburg, for instance, I'll give you an example. There's a statue that depicts, a very famous statue actually, that depicts Peter the Great, and he's on a horse and he's spearing a giant snake, dragon, something like that, but it looks like a snake. And it's not that he, went to South America and killed an anaconda or something. No, the snake represents Sweden because they were at war for, the Baltic. Just like all European countries, they were always fighting each other and changing borders and so forth, depending on who won the battle. But in this case, it was he had defeated the Swedes. And so this statue was made to commemorate his defeating the Swedes, who are represented as a snake. Couldn't Swedes feel that this is in some way insulting to them and say this should be removed? Although there are statues in Sweden that they don't really depict the Danes so well. And so forth. Now, we could say these statues that commemorate war heroes or kings that defeated other empires and so forth are not in accordance with the idea of peace and brotherly love. That they are in some way promoting a sense of hypermasculinity and warmongering. That when people see these, they still have this sense that violence can achieve your ends. And to be honest, too, look at England. England has lots of statues to religious leaders. Germany has statues to Martin Luther and so forth. Couldn't you say, especially since these countries tend to either ignore or they're not very they're actually outright agnostic or atheist. They ignore religion. That these statues could in some way promote the idea amongst impressionable young people that religion is still a viable sort of human existence, aspect of human existence. And of course, if you're religious, you're going to be saying, well, no, these should say these are good to have. And on the other hand, the people who are atheists could say, this is offensive to me. This could influence young people unfairly. And since they're on often state property, the state is in some way still endorsing religion, even though many European countries have cut loose of the idea of an official state church. So ultimately there, you could argue that these should be taken down. But the aspect of taking people's history down means that you change history. Because like in Orwell's 1984, you change people's perception of where they came from. And therefore, just like in Soviet times, you might have Stalin, shaking hands with someone or standing next to. It's easier with those. He's standing next to some really high up Communist Party official. But then later that Communist Party official ran afoul of Stalin. And so they would go and they would erase all of the references to this leader and take his name out of the books and even go to encyclopedias and replace, at probably great expense, have to replace all the encyclopedias that had a picture of that particular person. And put some other story in, and also you would just see Stalin standing there, but no picture of that person. This is what's troubling to me. And so, in a sense, I would be more inclined to feel that we should, in communities where, let's say you're in the South, there should be statues that commemorate civil rights leaders who stood up and wanted equality. I would say that maybe for our Western history, West as in, West in the United States, there should be monuments and statues to American Indians who, yes, they resisted being assimilated and they rebelled and they lost, but their story and their history and culture needs to be maintained as well. And I think ultimately, if we just start sanitizing everything, then we are going to be threatening ourselves with sanitizing, well, everything. And eventually we just won't have anything. We'll have, some modern art with a ball or something, or something like that, or a pyramid, or, oh, no, you can't, no, I can't do the pyramid. See, that's another thing that's wrong with the Washington Monument. If you do a pyramid, then you're culturally appropriating from the Egyptians. Oh, I know, you'll say, well, yeah, but they had pyramids in Mesoamerica, but those pyramids had a little bit of different look about them than the pyramids we think of in Egypt, near Cairo. And so you see what road we go when we do this, because then we open up everything to just fighting. So maybe in Utah, if you say, well, let's remove the statue of Brigham Young, maybe a majority of people in Utah, being Mormon, are going to say, no, we don't support that. But maybe, let's say, with immigration and so forth, eventually Utah is not majority Mormon. And then later a vote's taken and it's gone. But this could be done with all kinds of cultural symbols and so forth. And again, I think this is what the left wants, is to be able to do an erasure and then a replacement of other things. Maybe put Karl Marx on Mount Rushmore instead of Thomas Jefferson. I don't know. But I'll bet you if you went to a college campus nowadays and suggested that maybe you could replace at least Jefferson and Washington with, Marx and Engels, I will venture to say you would get a lot of students who'd be saying, yeah, that sounds like a good idea. And they would support such a thing. All right? So don't think that ideas are crazy, because there's always people out there who will support them. And renaming the state of Washington, I'll bet you if you got a petition drive up, and this is only a guess, I would say you would get at least a quarter of Washington's population. I'm talking about mostly in the Seattle area. A quarter of the population would be up for changing the name of Washington State. Seriously, I really do think that you could get a quarter of the people who would be willing to change the name of the state. And there's a lot of these things you can look at, and I think it's a minority of people that anywhere that want to change stuff. Of course, then again, you can ask poll questions in such a way that it makes it look like a majority. But I think the majority of people are just kind of like, okay, leave things or have other commemorations. So you have a balance, so everyone feels like they're represented in this whole thing. But just getting rid of history is like saying, well, now we need to curtail freedom of speech. Maybe we need to get rid of the First Amendment, because the First Amendment allows people that say bad things to actually wind up having a platform, and it's protected. And I'll guarantee you, not one person listening to this right now, I don't care if you're left wing, right wing, or whatever, not one person listening to this can go through, several days of talking to other people and so forth and not say something that other people, if you were like running for political office, if it could be dug up, be it a joke, be it just a statement, be it an assumption, could not be used against you and made you look really bad and evil and awful and nasty. Okay? It is definitely the case. I mean, I think everyone has something in their past that could wind up on the Jerry Springer show. Okay? I mean, no one's perfect. And so the thing is that it's kind of, at least in my opinion, it's better to err on the side of assuming that people are going to be smart enough and good enough and decent enough that when people say really nasty things in public, that most people will just ignore them. I mean, I think that's the best thing to do. But unfortunately, with our media, and this goes for all sides when it comes to, I hate to use these terms because ultimately there's ways that they don't really describe the situation, that the ultra-right or the ultra-left, they know that the media looks for sensation, especially now, clickbait. Okay? Newspapers don't have subscribers anymore. Oh, they do. Magazines do too. But not as many. They live on the internet now. That's where they generate their money. So ironically, when you click on a link to, let's say you're right wing, and there's a story that a commentator from a left wing network news show has said something really nasty about conservatives, and you just need to see that. You click it on. See, they know this, and that's why it drives up their revenue. Because if they just had a story about, there was a duck that had albino ducklings or something. Well, human interest story, it might get a few thousand clicks. Unless you throw a kitty cat picture in there or something like that, and maybe you'll get more. But if you put in something where someone just totally makes an outlandish, horrible statement about someone, then it gets a lot of people that are angry clicking on that story. Well, you've just fallen into the trap. Yeah, that's right. You've just gotten in there and you've clicked on, and now that the advertisers are going to be shown that data. Oh, look how much traffic we generate on our page. And they don't care if, you're angry while you're reading the story, because you're still seeing the advertising. And this is what is generating a lot of the hostility in the United States right now. And it's going to continue, and it's going to grow. Because the media not just the media, the media is in a symbiotic relationship with all radical organizations. No, I'm not saying a conspiracy necessarily, but I am saying that the media likes controversy. They like it when someone does something radical, extreme, and stupid or whatever. And so they'll cover that event. And the people that organize these kinds of events, they know it. So they become even more radical. They get symbols that will then be used to unite their followers, because they know that they're going to get more publicity, they're going to get more followers. That's the irony. This thing in Charlottesville, you think this is not going to help Antifa get more members? You think it's not going to help the people on the other sides, be they the alternative right or the neo-Nazis or whatever? You think that they're not going to grow because of this? It's given them a certain sense of legitimacy, because now they're in the news. Their name's in print, or the organization or the cause is in print. And now they are going to get followers. And they know that they go to another town and organize something, they'll get more. But the media knows that this is what people are going to look at, because most people lead kind of boring lives. Okay, we go to work, we come home, we make dinner for the kids, we sit there and whatever. Most people do not live the kind of life, that you're going to get a reality show created about you or your family. So you're seeking something that's adventurous. Our ancestors always had these things like, oh my gosh, the storm, is it going to destroy our crops? It got our adrenaline up. The Vikings are coming to raid us, or the Mongols are coming, or what's going to happen here? The Ottomans are thinking of invading our area, our country. These were things that were always kind of, going on, and we expect it. But nowadays it's kind of like we get this instant gratification and thrill. That's why they have that term called, what is it called? You see all these documentaries about fatal storms and floods and stuff, and there's a term for that in the media, and that's called weather porn. Because they know that it catches your attention. If you just come on with the weather and say, so anyway, the concept of weather porn is the idea that media shows you something that will catch your attention. If they catch your attention, they have you. They have you as audience, and then you'll sit and watch for the commercials. So anything that actually brings you to sit and pay attention and not turn the channel is something that will be something they will use, because it's money for them. And ultimately, the media is in this for money. So the problem is, then this creates a situation where everyone's thinking sensationally. They think everything is based on, look at the world, what's happening, everything's going wrong. There's wars and destruction and disease and pestilence, and people are acting crazy and immorality and all this kind of stuff. When in reality, much of this is really overblown, and most people just live regular, everyday lives. Another aspect of this sensationalism I want to deal with is, I think that what you can wind up with is that eventually what now is seen as sensationalism may become what people expect. So it becomes part of the expectations of what will happen in the future. So I'd like to take a little bit of a diversion here away from the entire thing about the historical monuments and the way the media is driving its own agenda, which to a large degree is devoted to money, and how all these various groups are interacting within themselves and outside. And that is the idea of what is actually going to be the final objective. Now, the far left really does want to replace what we consider American history and culture. You have to do it. I explained earlier. If people have an identity with their history, then they have a sense of it being a long-term, almost a living organism to a degree. You're part of a chain. You're part of what is expected to continue. Now, if you break that, then people no longer have those roots. It's like pulling up a tree. And then it's easier to put something else in its place. And so obviously the far left wants this as a goal, wants this as an objective. They really do want to replace the United States completely. Okay? And so we know what their objective is, at least the more radical fringes. But now let's think about this for a minute. I did see, I'm just going to touch on this for a moment. There's an article in Zero Hedge that came out recently. And actually recently, it came out this year. Okay? So this came out before any of this stuff in Charlottesville. But it's titled, Globalists Want to Destroy Conservative Principles, but They Need Our Help. And what it's dealing with is the radicalization of, it begins at least with the radicalization of the left. When people feel like something's been yanked from them, many of them may feel that they feel a certain despair, maybe even giving up. I did a program recently on testosterone where when people feel defeated, their testosterone levels go down. And testosterone is usually associated with aggression, but it's also associated with people going out and doing something. Aggression can be a positive thing. We always just think of it as someone punching someone in the face. When in reality, aggression is getting up and putting your jogging shoes on and going for a run. that takes a certain level of aggression. You're out there to defeat a foe. Maybe that's your own body. You look at your body as being, I'm going to fix this thing. Going out and applying for a job, asking someone on a date, any of these kinds of things are aggression. Now, many of the people who make up kind of the left, so to speak, and I don't mean the hard left, I mean people that are more on the liberal side. For 8 years, they had a feeling it was never going to end. Under Obama, the idea was that the world was just going to keep on, and all the goals of the social justice people were going to be realized. Excuse me. And eventually America would become something similar to, Northern Europe, when it came to socialism and so forth. And then Obama, the idea was many of them were feeling like, hey, Bernie's the man. And many others were more pragmatic, like, okay, Hillary's not perfect, but she'll keep the ball rolling. And they thought, there's no way Trump's going to get elected. There's zero, and I do mean zero, chance that Trump is going to get elected in their mind. But as noted in the article, and I'm going to kind of leave it there except for a major premise it brings up, as noted by the article, there was a part of the left that they probably felt this level of frustration and anger, and then decided it's time to become mobilized and not just sit back and say, well, let's just go for the next congressional election, or in 2020 we'll vote Trump out, but more of we're taking direct action now. And I'm going to get into some of the stuff that was brought up in this article in regards to maybe we should be careful, if by we, meaning the society in general, should be very careful about how we deal with some of these people when they do take things a little too far. Now, as I stated earlier, I think that the left has grown. And I also think that when people feel frustrated in the face of a prevailing culture that says no to their objectives, then they're going to not redefine the objectives so much as they're going to use different strategies. I'll give you an example. A couple months ago, I dealt with this on a show, that the left was sort of in this kind of stage after World War II. More specifically in the 50s. The standard of living for working Americans, and this was going on in Europe too, but I'm just going to center on America. The standard of living for working Americans was going up. And so the allure of the left, the whole class warfare thing, stuff like that, proletariat rise up and overthrow the shackles of the dominant industrial class type thing, just was not something that was taking root in the working class, who now were starting to move into the middle class. So what did they do? They started a policy of dealing with going after the culture and, actually using sexuality during the sexual revolution in a political sense, and trying to fragment the society on lines such as gender and so forth. And this was part of the tactic to, long term, not short term, but long term. And it still, one of the kind of ironic situations was that it actually wound up giving rise to this idea of, breaking away from the societal norms and so forth, actually, ironically, led to the creation of this sense of the rugged individualist who set their own agenda And that gave rise to Ronald Reagan and conservative politics, at least with a certain segment of these generations. Now, today you're seeing kind of the same thing. There is this sense of what do we do? And as the article here suggests, it could be that the left will mobilize and start getting so much attention that people on the right will start thinking maybe some of the policies that Barack Obama set up in DAA and some of this other stuff could actually come in handy. You start using the weapons that were originally designed to be used for other people, at least in their minds, and start using it on the people that actually did it. It's kind of like, these kinds of things are a double-edged sword. I remember reading about a community quite some time ago, back when actually before the internet pretty much redefined pornography. And feminist and Christian conservatives had gotten together to enact laws in their community that would get rid of the porn stores. And so they worked together thinking, yay, we don't like each other, but this is an issue we agree on, so we're going to be pragmatic about it. And after they got the laws in, then there was a feminist bookstore that actually was questioned by authorities or something. The problem was that some of their own erotic literature, which they considered erotica, but under the law could be considered pornographic, the law kind of took aim at them. And that is a danger you have when you make laws that can for instance, curtail freedom of speech or press, freedom of assembly, and so forth. Maybe the left just wants to prod the right and by right, I mean the right wing in general. I'm not going to break it up according to the various subgroups. But let's say the ones that are a little bit more out there and the right that is out there and looking for a kind of a street battle or something. Well, the left gives them the ability to do it. And all of a sudden, you get fights in our streets. And, I'm hearing this from a lot of people saying, that I have in my social media that are from other countries going, I wouldn't want to visit America right now. It seems so chaotic and maybe even dangerous. And perception creates reality. And if it turns into the idea that if someone wants to get in a good street brawl, which a lot of people have this as part of their instinctive, repressed Freudian drives, or you could say evolutionary past, or just fallen nature, whatever you want to call it. Some people like to have a good fight. And so what if it starts turning into the idea that whenever these kinds of rallies start, you start getting bigger and bigger and bigger rallies, and you get more violence, more, injuries, or even worse? Well, that's when you're going to have pressure put on government officials to do something about it. And maybe you take aim at the extremes, the extreme right, the extreme left, and so forth. And the problem with that is everyone's got a different definition. I'm going to go back to the whole pornography thing. Everyone's got a different definition of what pornography is. Okay? Some people think pornography is showing any nudity whatsoever. I know people like that who feel that even museums should not be allowed to show naked portraits. There's other people that feel that even people engaged in a sex act, it could actually just be artistic. I know people like that too. I know people that have taken part in putting on displays that, that would be, art, so-called displays that I'm sure many people would find quite objectionable. But the thing is that everyone has a different definition. So what if we start talking about different definitions of what should come under hate speech, or what should come under the definition of things that could incite violence, things that could incite problems? Then you wind up in a situation in which it's up to whoever the government officials are. It goes into what they are. It turns into a situation where it's going to be arbitrary. You're going to have people making decisions and saying, oops, well, the prevailing political wind right now says we can get away with censoring this. And it doesn't matter who the president is. The bureaucracy is huge. The social media networks are huge. The corporations are huge. The corporations and, of course, social media can work hand in hand. The social media makes its money. The social media giants make their money off corporate advertising. Corporations get pressure to curtail some people's abilities to use social media. And pretty soon, maybe you, maybe I, who knows who, winds up getting caught in the net. And that can actually take place. It's happened many, many times. If you look at government throughout, you could, ever since Noah got off the boat and established some sort of government, I'm sure, you find that people have had problems with this, that you run afoul of the powers that be. And even if you don't really even mean to run afoul of the powers that be, you could still wind up getting in trouble. So many of the laws that now are in the hands of, you might feel like, the Republicans won't do anything. Who says they won't? Okay, there's a lot of stuff that goes on in politics behind doors. The old smoke-filled rooms, they used to say. I guess nowadays maybe it's not smoke, maybe it's cocaine or something like that nowadays. But things are decided. I think probably most of our policies in the United States are not decided in public, even though we made a lot of laws back in the 60s and 70s to try to make it to where we had policies that would be make open door laws and things like that. Well, there's ways to get around those things. And they've had a long time to be very creative about it. So this, I think, could be a danger that each side maybe has an incentive to poke and poke and poke. The left maybe to see just how far they can take it. How far they can take it to unleash their aggressions and all the things they have pent up in their subconscious minds in a Freudian perspective. And the right, probably the same thing. And then you have a situation in which either A, you have anarchy, which might serve the extreme on both sides, or you have the government crack down on the anarchists, which depends on who's in charge, who takes the brunt the most. But often in revolutions, like in the Soviet Union, the people that they first went after were not necessarily the people that they considered reactionaries, the conservative-ish type people who might oppose communism, but they went after fellow revolutionaries, because fellow revolutionaries can actually cause bigger problems. I think you see the same thing in Nazi Germany. Many of Hitler's closest allies, bringing him to power, were eventually, like in the Night of the Long Knives, they were eliminated. So this is how politics works, and I don't see that there's anything that makes America special in the sense that that would not be the case for the United States. So, because we're made up of humans, and humans are psychological creatures, and psychology is the same. But everyone's got all these different motivations that people that call themselves leaders can channel. So think about that for a moment. Think about that for a moment. This could, some people are saying we're in a civil war. Now, I think that's pushing it a little bit much, and maybe even saying we're starting to get into a civil war could actually create the reality out of the expectation or the perception. But I think it could happen. I really do think it could happen. And socially, if people become more and more polarized, and we see this with social media, everyone just, I see it on even Facebook. People make a post. If you didn't vote for Trump, if you voted for Hillary, just remove me from the friends list. And I saw yesterday, if you voted for Trump, just please remove me from the friends list. And, personally, I think people should communicate with each other because everyone can learn from one another. And there are valid reasons why someone might want to be a Democrat or might want to be a Republican. But we're getting to the point now where I'm even kind of worried about saying that because I'm afraid someone's going to turn off the radio. They're going to say, oh, forget that. How could he say that there's something I can learn from a Democrat, for instance? The thing is, you can. And this is one of the things that's helped America be a dynamic nation, is, we communicate with one another. We're not closed off. We share our opinions. We're not like Sweden, where people just kind of get on a bus and they don't talk to each other. They just are quiet and stare out the window. We're not like that. But the problem is we're starting to filter out people. If you've got 1,000 people on your social media friends list, for instance, then you feel like you can do without maybe the 50 that voted for Trump or the 50 that didn't vote for Trump. Okay? And if you're more radical than that, you have a more hardcore position, then you can even be more ideologically pure. Get rid of 500 of your friends. But now you got that 500 that you agree with each other completely. And then you have feeding into each other. You have people wanting to go a little bit more extreme. And this polarization is taking place all over the internet. And the internet's where we live now. Okay? The internet has, I hate to say this, the internet is the kind of place where a lot of people are finding their true love on the internet. A lot of people are meeting other people who share their, and this is good. You find people that share your interest or your religion or so forth, and you get together and get married. Fantastic. There's other people, I've pointed out in previous shows, they go on the internet, let's say a single woman goes on the internet and looks through fertility clinics and finds the perfect man that she wants to be the father of her children because she can't find a husband and the biological clock is nearing, 11 p.m. and she's going, it's now or never. And unfortunately, there's a lot of, young men, but not just young men, but young men who substitute the internet pornography for a real relationship. The internet's where we work. The internet's how we communicate to one another. And so these are our new communities. And they're wide and varied. You can find anything and everything in all your social media networks. If you're artistic, especially if you're liberal, but if you're artistic and you want to share some of your art, you can go on Pinterest or Tumblr. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the problem is, one of the problems that can occur is that then we always feed into one another, and we become more into that mob mentality, but just online. Now, of course, you can't just go into virtual world type place or something and have a riot. But what happens in a few years when this gets more and more and more advanced, where we throw in some virtual reality? Okay, that's something to think about, where maybe people will organize better. But already this polarization is existing. Now let's just forget about virtual reality for a moment and what could happen. Let's just say, what if tomorrow the economy crashed? What if, I don't know, North Korea were to blow up Guam and people freak out over a limited nuclear war, and markets crash and people lose their jobs and so forth? What happens then? You take away money, and it's like a marriage relationship, okay? Two people that can barely stand each other can still make their marriage work because they know that they can't survive without one another economically. They might live in a really nice house in the suburbs, but if they divorce, they're both going to be living in an apartment someplace. So they stick together, and sometimes they actually do make it work and regain their happiness. But if you have a situation where those two people can barely get along with each other, and then one or both of them lose their jobs, that's when trouble starts. That's when you get increases in violence within a marriage, both from the male and the female. It's where you get hatred. You can get even so much as a murder take place when you take that economics away. Because that's the livelihood. You can depend on the money coming in to pay for the food and all the other necessities of life. You take that away, and the natural reaction is to panic. And if you do that at a national level, at a point where all of a sudden you increase, I don't know, maybe 10% more people are unemployed, that's when people start thinking, what do I have to lose? So many of the people that were just on chat lines talk about how horrible the right is, or how horrible the left is, or how this or that or whatever. Now, instead of it just being something on the internet, where they blow off steam, they might actually start taking to the streets. And then they meet the people who are from the other side. They may have the same gripes, but they have a different ideology about it and philosophy. And then they start fighting. And then you could, I believe, I was talking to someone from the Middle East the other day, and she was mentioning the thing about what's going on with America, and I did say this could wind up being like some of the countries in the Middle East where you have these civil wars, not like the one that I was talking about with the Confederate memorial things, but where you had actual armies from the Union and armies from the Confederacy fight one another using standard military protocol and procedure, but you actually have neighbor versus neighbor, literally, where you have street violence, where you have something that, again, looks like something from The Walking Dead. You could easily wind up with this. And I could actually see the United States breaking up into different regions, just like what happened with the Soviet Union. The South maybe going its way, the extreme Northwest going its way, California going its way, the Mormon states going their way, and some of the other states maybe in the East maybe join up with Canada. I could easily see that, whereas I remember when a Russian economist proposed this taking place about 15 years ago, I thought he was insane. Now I don't think so. It could happen. Anyway, these are just a few points to ponder, and hope you go out there and research this stuff, because I think you'll find it actually quite fascinating. We're living in very interesting times. Anyway, take care, and I'll catch you next week with another edition of Unlock the Door Radio here on UCY TV Productions.